Hello everybody. Welcome again to Storytime from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today comes from California, and it's a story that was told by the Native Indians who lived in those parts. This is the story of Coyote's new hairdo. Once long ago, there was a bird. His name was Sapsucker, and he looked something like this. He was a very handsome fellow. Bright red were the feathers of his head and his breast, and he knew how to comb them up into such a fancy hairdo, and how to dress himself up so he looked the most elegant of birds. Twice a day he bathed, whether he was in the mountains or near the coast. And he liked to comb his hair different ways so that he would look different from all of the other birds of his own kind. And it seemed that everybody was always talking about Sapsucker and his new hairdo. And if he wasn't out parading around and showing it off, then he was in his lodge making new hairnets. Now, Coyote was very jealous of Sapsucker's good looks. "Only my wife ever looks at me," said Coyote. "If only I had beautiful red hair like Sapsucker. So handsome I would be." And so he tried putting the juice of red berries on his hair, but it only stained his fur with patches of purple and brown. "Well, if I could make my hair stand up in a fancy crest like Sapsucker uses." And Coyote tried combing it straight up, but it just fell back down again. And then he tried tying it up with a thong, but it just fell out. The thong didn't hold. And then he got it all wet, and he shaped it very carefully so that it stuck up in a spike. But as soon as it dried out, his hair just flopped back down on top of his head. So finally, he just couldn't think of any other way to do it. He went to Sapsucker, and he said, "Sapsucker, you have such beautiful hairdos, and you make such beautiful hair nets to hold them up. Could you maybe teach me how to make these bolmaki, these hair nets? What do you make the string out of? It seems so fine, and the weaving looks so delicate. Of course, I know that you'll laugh at my attempt to make them, but perhaps you could teach me? Everybody teases me, and I just want to look nice like you." Well, Sapsucker thought about it for a moment, and he said, "Well, thank you, Brother Coyote, for the compliments on my hair nets and my hairstyles. I won't lie to you. It is not easy to make the hair like this, but it is not very difficult either. Your hair should do quite well with a big, smooth, high crest. And your hair is not as brightly colored as mine, and so no one will confuse us, so I will teach you how to make the bolmaki, the hair nets." Well, Coyote was very excited. And Sapsucker said, "Now what you must do is you must take the kololo plant, and you must scrape off the outside like this, and use it just like the fishermen do to make their fishing nets out of the milkweed fibers and things. And what you must do then is you must mash it up and mix it up with water, and then stretch it out on a rock next to the fire until it is as dry as bone. And when it is dry, then you twist it together into strings, 10 or 15 times the length of your arms or something like that. That's roughly what I use. And then you twist them up and you weave them into the net. See, here is one that I have half finished." Well, Coyote looked at the half-finished hairnet, and he said, No, I do not think you are telling me the truth, Sapsucker. I think you do not want me to look as good as you, for it cannot be that easy. The hairnet, it's all soft, and it's slippery, and it would not hold your hair up." And Sapsucker said, "But friend Coyote, it is that easy. I wet my hair and pull it up, and then I put the hairnet over the top, and I slip in the hair skewer, and it stays." And Coyote said, "I do not think you are telling me the truth, Sapsucker. You shook your head and your top knot did not move at all. There must be another trick to it." Well, it did not matter how Sapsucker argued with Coyote. Coyote would not believe that the trick was that simple. And so finally, as Sapsucker could see that he was not going to get Coyote to leave him alone until he told him something that made more sense to Coyote, Sapsucker said, "Well, all right. I can see that you are not very easy to fool, Coyote. So I will tell you, if you will go to the forest in the early morning and find a sugar pine tree, you will find the sap dripping out of it. And if you take that pitch out of the tree and the sap and you roll it up and you smooth it into your hair, then it will hold just something like those pitch balls that we make to start our fires, but smaller, and rub it into your hair very, very well, and then it will hold." "Aha," said Coyote, "I knew you were not telling me the truth." And so he went out in search of the kololo plant so that he could get ready with his fine twine to make his string for tying his hairnet. And then in the morning, he would go to the forest and find the sugar pine trees. Now, of course, Sapsucker did not use pine pitch in his hair. He did not use sap in his hair. But Coyote would not believe him otherwise, and so he had told him something that he knew would make Coyote's hair be sticky and stay in its hair, in its shape when he put it up. So the next morning, Coyote picked up his kololo, the plant that he had all made ready into nets, and then he went out into the forest and he went looking for the sap from the sugar pine tree. When he found a sugar pine tree, he gathered a bunch of the sap and he rolled it up into a pitch ball. And then he went down to the edge of the lake. When he got down to the edge of the lake, he set down his pitch ball. And he set down his hairnet that he had prepared. And he got his paws all wet in the water. And he got his hair all wet. And he stretched it up into a nice little comb. And then he took his bit of twine and he wrapped it round and tied it up with his hairnet, just as Sapsucker had told him. And then before he put the hair stick in, he dipped it into the pitch and got a little dab on the end of it and started smoothing it into his hair. And then he dipped in the pitch a little more and got a little more in there, but it was taking a very, very long time. And he wanted as many people in the village as possible to see him when he was going down to the sweat lodge with the rest of the men later that day. And he knew that it would take far too long if he just kept taking a little tiny bit on the hair stick. And so he set down his hair stick and then he reached to that pitch ball and he got his paws all sticky with pitch and he rubbed them into his hair, into his little top knot so that he could keep it up there in the air. And then he stuck his hair stick into it. And then he realized that the string that had been tying the hair up was stuck to his paw. But his hair wasn't moving. It wasn't going anywhere. And he went over and bent over the edge of the lake and he looked in to make sure it looked all right. To be honest with you, it looked a little bit like Coyote had a third ear on top of his head. But Coyote thought it looked very handsome indeed. And so then he got some dust and he rubbed it on his paws and he rubbed his paws together to get all of the pitch off of them. And then he trotted back off to his home. And when he got home, he dressed himself in his finest rabbit skin robe. And he put on his best going to the sweat lodge clothes. And he started to parade through the village, feeling very fine indeed, because he had his fine new hairdo. And as he went through the village, he could hear people saying, "Who is that with that fine hairdo? Is that Coyote? Yeah, it looks like Coyote. How did he learn to make his hair so fine? Looks like Coyote might be trying to attract Sapsucker's daughters. Coyote, what does your wife think of that?" But although the people were teasing him, he could tell that they rather liked his hairdo, and he was very proud of it. Now, when he got to the sweat lodge, all of the other men of the village were waiting outside for they were waiting for the fire builders to tell them that the fire was hot enough to go inside. For you see, they liked to go into the sweat lodge and get very hot and sweaty, and then they would run out to the river and jump in the cold water, and it would clean them off, and they would feel very, very clean indeed. And so they were waiting for the fire tenders to tell them that the fire was hot enough. Well, as they all stood about, several people complimented Coyote on his new hairdo, and then someone suggested that they have a fanning contest when they got inside the lodge. Now, with a fanning contest, what happened was one person would sit on the other side of the fire from all of the others, and they would take fans and they would blow the hot air from the fire. They would wave the fans and blow the hot air from the fire onto the person on the other side of the fire. And they would stay as long as they could handle the heat. And then they would move off and someone else would take their place. So they all decided that since Coyote had his brand new hairdo and it was so very fine, he should be the first one in front of the fire. And so when the fire tenders came out and they said that the fires were ready, Coyote went in and he went to the far side of the lodge and he sat down on the far side of the fire. And all of the others came in and they picked up the deerskin fans and they began to fan and fan and fan as hard as they could, blowing that hot, dry air straight at Coyote. Well, it did not take long at all for Coyote to become very warm and to start panting with all of the heat. And he stayed there for as long as he possibly could, for it was better in a fanning contest to stay longer rather than to stay shorter. But eventually the heat got to be a little too much for him, and so he thought he would move aside and let someone else take his place. But when Coyote moved aside, all of the other animals moved too, and they kept blowing all the hot air towards Coyote. As he moved around the fire, they moved too, so that they kept blowing all the hot air. And Coyote said, "Aha, a game we are playing then. I can take part in this game too." And he snatched up another fan, and he began waving it towards all of the other animals. They were having so much fun doing it, blowing the hot air towards each other and blowing the hot air towards each other, and Coyote was being fanned and Mink was being fanned. Everyone was getting very, very warm, for of course when you do that much exercise and you're getting hot air blown onto you, you get very, very warm very, very quickly. Now, outside the sweat lodge, the women of the village were getting a little bit concerned, for there was so much smoke coming out of the sweat lodge that they were beginning to expect to see it burst into flames at any moment. What on earth can those silly men be doing inside the sweat lodge, they wondered. And they watched, and there was more smoke and more smoke. And suddenly, out of the sweat lodge came running Mink. Now, Mink had a very thick fur coat, and so he usually couldn't stand the heat quite as long as everyone else. He came running out of the sweat lodge, and he cast his fan off to the side, and he ran out to the water, and he jumped into the river. And when he did, the river hissed and sizzled. His fur was so hot. And the steam rose off the river where Mink jumped in. And all of the ladies looked at each other and sighed, "The men are going to be melted in there or burnt up. It's too hot. What is wrong with them? They're going to make themselves sick." Well, the men had made the inside of the sweat lodge so warm that the pitch in Coyote's hair was no longer hard. In fact, it was beginning to melt. At first, his grand new top knot just wilted a little bit, and he didn't even notice because he was so busy fanning and fighting the others in the fanning fight they were having. But suddenly, as that top knot began to wilt and curl over, a drop of pitch fell out of it, and it fell right on his shoulder. "Yay!" he said. Now, all of the other people in the sweat lodge thought that he was crying, yelling out because it was too warm, and they said, "Oh, it's nothing in here. These fires are not so hot as when we were young," and they fanned even harder. Well, of course, the harder they fanned, the more hot air came at Coyote, and the more pitch began to dribble out of off of his hair onto his nose, onto his shoulders, onto his chest. Ay, 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 he yelled, and the pitch actually started to burn. It had gotten that hot that it burst into flames, and out came Coyote, streaking out of the sweat lodge with his hair on fire. He ran through the village running for the water, and all of the little youngsters in the village saw him streak by, and they started yelling, "Oh, look, old Coyote is burning up. Coyote's hair is burning up. Come and see, come and see." And all the children came running, and all the women came running, as blazing like a torch, Coyote ran down to the creek. When he got there, he jumped in head first. Well, of course, jumping into the water washed out all the fire. It went out. But the damage had been done. Not only was Coyote's beautiful topknot gone, all of his hair was gone. His head was completely bald. He looked like somebody had shaved all of his hair off. And the villagers stood there and they stared. And Coyote glared back at them. "Oh, Coyote, Coyote, Coyote," said his wife, "can't you ever be satisfied with the way you look? Can you never stop coming up with new ways to get yourself in trouble? Now look at you. You're bald as an egg." Well, all of the men politely didn't say anything, but one of the women, many of the women laughed, and one of them said, "Mrs. Coyote, I am curious. Why only Coyote's hair? Why did not the other men's hair burn up?" Well, Mrs. Coyote had already talked to Sapsucker, for Sapsucker had begun to feel that perhaps he might have told Coyote something wrong, and that Coyote might get that pitch stuck in his hair and he'd never get it out. And so he had warned Mrs. Coyote about the pitch that Coyote was going to stick in his hair. And so Coyote's wife said, "Well, let me tell you what my husband has done now." Well, the other women laughed and laughed to hear it. And they said, "Never have we heard of such a foolish thing." Well, Mrs. Coyote went down to the creek, and she took her husband by his arm, and she helped him home, and she put him in bed, and she covered his burnt head with grease, and she hushed his groans, and she sang him to sleep. "That is my Coyote," she said. And from that day to this, Coyote's head has been quite bald. And that is the story of Coyote's new hairdo from the Native Americans, the Indians who lived in California in the United States. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll come back and join us again at 3 p.m. Central Time for another story here from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. See you later, everyone. Bye.